And good evening. It's July 30th, 2024, and we're on our next collection of discussions in our Outside the Class series. This is Series in the Bible Project. It's about the entire TaNaK, the Old Testament. On TheDustyFeet.com, in the Outside the Class section, we have the TaNaK, the Old Testament source video section set up for your review. Because the intent of Outside the Class is for you to listen to the in-class lecture first. They would all be found in that source video playlist. We try to keep these to around 15 minutes or so. We want to make them easy to catch and easier to catch up on. So we're on a quest, scroll by scroll, book by book, a journey through this collection, but with a fun and maybe different twist. On Outside the Class, on the Dusty Feet. And before we forget, if you find these kinds of podcasts useful, you can click the subscribe button. Those reminders, they just help you. But also, if you think these might be useful to others, it's when you click that like button, because that is the way that YouTube chooses to share these to more people if they wish. So in this series, we're going to be covering the entire TaNaK, right, that Old Testament, and yet we're going to be doing it in the original order of this collection, the Hebrew Scriptures order. So it could get interesting once we get past these first 5. Remember, these videos we're going to be discussing, they're just the tip of the iceberg. They're part of a learning series that I highly recommend, and they can all be found on the Bible Project website. Because, as we're in this series, I kind of want us to remember that there's probably going to be more questions than we have answers. I mean, we're going to try to respond to some of the information, and as we discuss it, well, I'm going to leave it up to you if it's an answer. But there's going to be a lot of questions we're going to be asking about all kinds of things, of which we're probably not going to know. It is what it is. So the TaNaK, the Old Testament, Genesis, Bereshit, right? We're in chapters 12 through 50, and this is our final part, part 4. So we left off with warning labels, these cautionary stories, ones that should give us pause. To be fair, they didn't have warning labels on things like we do today, right? Back then, it had to be passed on. It was learned and then passed on to people, to generation, after generation, after generation. Today we have stickers, and we have YouTube to remind us that folks continue to not read, heed, listen, or learn. So I can see why this is there, right? And I can see why it's here in these stories, whether it's the wives, whether it's not loving the wives. Because Torah, it talks about, it addresses every single one of these things, every single behavior that we see in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and more. Because this is to remind them, the children of Israel, that this is something that they didn't want to bring into the land that was with them. Looking back, you can see why it said, don't do it. But when we look back, we see it in Torah and we go, oh, after the whole thing, now I really understand. So back to Jacob with Laban. He gets deceived that what goes around comes around. Then we get that wrestling story, and Tim calls it wrestling with God. Not necessarily compelled by that. I think it's something that we've been traditionally taught, but I think we really want to look at the story. I think it might tell us something just a little bit different. For sure, he wrestles with a messenger that's going up and down a ladder that we see other places in Scripture later on. But either way, he knows that this being, he wants something from him. Recognition. Jacob wrestles with it. And again, I'm hoping for the choice that he knows that something different can happen because of this, because he's going to stick with it. And he sticks with it until his demise and his name change. Okay, I shouldn't say demise. Rather, more to his detriment. In other words, he suffers from something that will be a malady that he has for the rest of his life. This will be forever impregnated upon his mind and his body, an event to remember. You know, some of us have this in our life. Some of us have an ache, a pain, something, or something's happened. Happened many, many years ago. My shoulder, for example, right? It's part of a cycling accident that I had many, many years ago, probably close to 30 years ago. I crashed really hard. You know, one of those Tour de France ugly things, right? Crash into a ditch. It didn't break anything, but the damage underneath, that's bothered me for and will be for the remainder, the rest of my days. And believe it or not, the story that goes with what's in my head and what played out has stayed with me for the rest of my life as well. Jacob, exact same thing we have. Just he has a more heavenly element to his story. It's not as simple as mine. Tim used a term that I liked, that God honored his tenacity, right? I think that maybe it's something like he honored his effort. Yeah? I think sometimes we don't think of God that way, that he would honor effort versus, what we think we know. Because I think there's a religious paradigm that it's perfect or nothing, that it's black and white, that it's if not this, then that. But as you know, with me here on the Dusty Feet, we have a little challenge with that. And I think we see I think this is a good and interesting example of this, because he decides to honor his effort with a blessing. So here is where Jacob gets his name change. We had Abram go to Abraham. Now we have Jacob going from Yaakov, from Jacob, to Israel. That's where we get the tag wrestles with God. So I think where we get it, obviously, is the thought that he's wrestling with God. Yet I'm more compelled that it's an attitude that he has, that he's going to hang on to that messenger, whoever he is, whoever he's wrestling with, to take this back to God. This is the argument that he has, the struggle he has, the thing that's going on with him. He's frustrated. He's reacting to a God element. And this is the struggle with that. Jacob has done this. And even with the blessing, he still has the physical reminder for the rest of his life. And his life? Well, we even see more of those deceiver repercussions with his family, of course, and we get to see that multifold. So here's the point where we get into the Joseph story. And now we have a number of videos on the Dusty Feet that we talk about Joseph, so it really doesn't make much sense to get caught up in the Joseph side. So please, go look them up. We have victims, egregious behavior, deceit, dreams, pride. Very messy. We have a term in our society, we call it soap opera territory. This is quite a lengthy story. And it gets us, obviously, to Egypt. Tim again uses the phrase later on his way, and he goes on about another family failure, right? Yet we, again, are we willing to put our lives and our choices up to the same lens, the same microscope, the same scrutiny? Just because they lived in that time, does that mean that they're that much different from us? Especially with our propensity to make decisions the way that we do. We just have this church thing, right? That we have this whole grace forgiveness thing. So are we different or are we the same? Do we view it as sucks to be them back then? Because we're different now. And in this part, as we get to Exodus, it'll really get more challenging for us. Because are our times really that different in some ways? Again, please feel free to take a listen to the videos that we have on Joseph. We will probably be doing more of those, right? Because there's so much to explore around his entire life. Remember we were talking about echoes? Well, the Messiah is all over this, right? But only in a backwards view, right? With all of our paradigms carried over our shoulder. Yeah, we have them in tow. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Start small. Promises given. Some of them, for those people, they'll never see the answer to those. But those families, they grow. The location shifts. Innocents are affected all around. And this is the walk through Torah, and this is just the first scroll of Genesis. Tim mentioned something towards the end. Caught my ear. That God wasn't ready to leave men to their own devices, starting with this up in Genesis in the first 3 chapters. And part of me went, when you know pre-flood that the story we actually get is that he leaves men to their own devices and they evolve down to there, right? Then we get the flood. And further on, now we're in 12 through 50, where we're well post-flood and we still have men moving to their own devices. Remember, but before we had Babel. That happened back in 1 through 11. We have them doing the same things, just in more different creative ways. What we have today, in spite of our drive to drive off a cliff with humanity, right, at breakneck speed at times, especially in today's climb, we're going to crash and burn. But God will still be involved. And if we want him to be involved in our lives, then his will play out. So are we part of the story? Or are we just one of the elements of the story? So there's a really interesting point that Tim makes at the end where he's talking about Jacob's final blessing to his sons. He's lying on his deathbed. He's making his final call to all of his sons. It's fascinating. Please read it, the entire read. Because Tim's just focused on Judah. And there are Messiah echoes all over this. I mean, they're bouncing off the canyon walls. Yet I wonder like the dreams that Joseph shared, right, those so many years ago. I wonder how the rest of the brothers took all of that in. Because I think that might have been a very interesting supper afterwards. So, we have a very high altitude look at the second part of Genesis, chapters 12 through 50. We have the promise, the covenant that really gets that other promise from back in the garden, right? It gets this ball rolling. And I think it's going to be even more interesting as we get that flyover of Exodus as well. Because that's just going to get our discussion started. So thanks for being with us tonight on another edition of Outside the Class as we get ready to look into Exodus and our look into the TaNaK, the Old Testament, on the Dusty Feet.